Okay, we'll begin the second session. I'm taking over now as chairman after John's laborious efforts this morning, and I thank him for that. He's been a wonderful friend to the James Hoban Society all along, and a wonderful friend to Bill Bashong as well. My involvement was really at the very beginning in 2002 when we began to look at, when I was living in the city of Charleston, where of course Hoban spent some time, we began to look at the prospect of commemorating him in some way. My first call was on Bill Bashong at the White House Historical Association offices, and the welcome he gave me on that occasion and the help he gave me on that occasion set the Hoban commemoration on a course that has never faltered or altered. We never had a bad day with James Hoban. And it should have died long ago, that movement, but in actual fact, it keeps going on and on. But I think I can say, and I speak on my wife's behalf as well as my own, that this is the last large event that we will organize under that heading. The material that was gathered in that 15-year odyssey is now in the College of Charleston in the Addleston Library, where there's a small archive of Irish American material, a lot of it to do with the history of Washington. And it's also a great pleasure to acknowledge people like Don and Pam, who have been with the movement from the beginning. I tried to persuade Don this morning that he had actually broken into tears when he saw for the first time that there was a Hoban Society, but he tells me that his memory of that was quite different. He was moved, but not that moved. But in any case, the goal of today was to try to bring together a group of speakers of all denominations, particularly those who had come to Hoban and come to the history of Washington without any preconceived notions or any strong Irish-American biases, if you like. In other words, that they would look at Hoban and his life and the way early Washington developed in a very unbiased, if not scholarly way. I didn't want to call it a scholarly event because scholarly events sometimes exclude people. But we're now at a stage in the development of the human mind where very ordinary people can have very great intellectual capacities and can become involved in events that would previously have been the preserve of people with PhDs. The internet and life has opened up these opportunities to people to be knowledgeable about many subjects and interested in many subjects. And that's a great, a wonderful thing, and a great tribute to Hoban and his history, that so many people come here today and that so many people were able to speak knowledgeably about him in that independent, semi-scholarly, and in many cases, totally scholarly way. And in the morning session, we kind of focused on, shall we say, the more academic and architecturally oriented areas of Washington history, early Washington history, and the Irish connections there. The goal in the afternoon session was to be a little bit more folksy, but because of the time situation, we now have an overrun of the morning program. But I'm delighted to say that probably of all the speakers we have today, the speaker I'm going to introduce now brings us great hope for the next generation of scholarly interest in Hoban. And he came to my attention through the recommendation of William Seal. And William has been in the business long enough to know when things are genuine and when things are not. And he kind of introduced the subject in a very careful way by saying, I think I found somebody in Florida who may be an answer to our prayers being that there would be a renewal of interest in Hoban into the future and into the next generation. And so we have a young man who is a graduate in history, and well, I better maybe follow the exact. Are you a graduate in history? He is a graduate in history. John gave me the document, but I've misplaced it somewhere. But anyway, he lives in Florida, is not. Oh, thank you, sir. Are we sure that's it?
That's his diploma.
Oh, that's his diploma. Okay, fine, thank you. He's an architectural historian and a graduate of Florida State University. His field of interest is the neoclassical architectural styles of the 18th century Anglosphere. I never knew what an Anglosphere was, but seemingly it's the place where British influence was reigned. And I don't know how much it contains other than Britain and Ireland, but maybe there are other countries. For instance, we were recently in Shanghai, where there's an entire area that grew out of British architectural dominance in that era, which is the 1930s actually. He's published a detailed analysis of James Hoban's original 1792 competition design for the President's House in White House History, the scholarly journal of the White House Historical Association. Made particular study of Hoban's life and work. This morning he'll guide us through Hoban's reconstruction of the President's House after the devastating fire of 1814. And that was information that I already knew. What I didn't know was what Andrew had included in his article in White House History. And some weeks ago I was able to go into the White House Historical Association and purchase the relevant issue of the journal, and was surprised and delighted to find out in the description of the authors there that Andrew McCarthy, it didn't quite say the greatest living expert, but it hinted that in the future Andrew McCarthy might very well be the greatest living expert on Hoban and his work. If that was a title I ever possessed, I now yield it unconditionally to our next speaker, Mr. Andrew McCarthy.
Thank you so much, Dennis. That is a truly great compliment, and I want to thank you for inviting me here, and William Seal for paving the way for me to speak here today. Without either of you, I wouldn't be here. I just want to thank you both. All right. Well, when I first began researching the rebuilding of the White House in 1817, I went to the primary source architectural plans from that time period. And looking at those drawings, I noticed details that led me to the theories I'm going to present to you here today. Many of you have probably looked at those drawings, studied them, maybe even written books about them, but I still think they hold secrets to be revealed if you look at them in the right way. They can tell us about forgotten architectural plans, sources of design inspiration, even shed some illumination on architects we thought we knew, like James Hoban. And I know some of my ideas here may be a bit controversial perhaps, but I'm hoping to start a conversation so that people might think about James Hoban, the architect of the White House, in a new perspective. The White House was first built beginning in 1792, a time when the neoclassical style of architecture, which Brian has so wonderfully introduced us to, which was based on ancient Roman models and was predominant in Britain, was just beginning to reach American shores. Architect James Hoban, who is an Irish immigrant who first arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, was fluent in this style, but although he won the competition to design the President's House, his ideas were tempered by the conservatism of his client, George Washington. Washington never visited Europe, and his taste in architecture was more conservative and unsophisticated as a result. He wasn't up to date with all the latest stylistic trends. His stylistic conservatism led Hoban to design a house that was more old-fashioned than he himself likely would have preferred. The model Hoban chose for his conservative client, George Washington, was Leinster House in Dublin. Today it's the Parliament House, but back then it was the residence of the Duke of Leinster, the highest-ranking nobleman in the Irish peerage. It was a stately Georgian townhouse, 3 stories tall, that was already half a century old by the time the White House began construction. Hoban took the tall, columned frontispiece of Leinster House as a model, which provided dignity even when, to save money, he had to delete the bottom floor from his original 3-story design in 1792. Here you may see a conjectural reconstruction by me of the White House design Hoban proposed in 1792. This is the north front as it might have looked had the original plan been built. And here's the south front. Again, Dennis kindly noted that I go into more detail on this in the White House History, issue 42. The building that Hoban built for Washington was packed with intricate carved detail on its exterior stonework. You have carved garlands and flowers, elaborate windowsills, even you have the griffins carved on the lintel over the front door there. George Washington even had to acknowledge that this detailing was no longer popular among architectural trendsetters by the time the house was completed. By the early 1800s, a new, radically austere style of architecture based on ancient Greek designs rather than Roman ones, this is called the Greek Revival, had taken root in England. And it reached America surprisingly swiftly because it was brought by Benjamin Henry Latrobe, an outstanding architect and James Hoban's chief rival in Washington. Latrobe's style was quickly taken up by fashionable American clients, especially those who thought ancient Greece, cradle of democracy, was better than Rome, which had devolved from a republic into an empire. Hoban's architecture was based on Roman precedents, and it, like George Washington's leadership style, which was based on deference and respect for authority rather than a democratic respect of everyone, no matter how low or high, these were both increasingly out of step with the spirit of the times. With Latrobe's arrival and rapid success in America, the previous Roman classical style, with its intricate detailing, began to fall out of fashion. The White House, already stylistically conservative when it was built, soon became passé. Hoban himself struggled to find success in Washington in Latrobe's shadow. He twice supplemented his architectural income in Washington, D.C. with return visits to Charleston. First, in 1798, he built the elegant townhouses at Vanderhorst Row, seen here, and the William Blacklock House in Charleston. Both of these houses share telltale architectural features with Desert Court in County Kilkenny, the Irish estate on whose grounds Hoban grew up. Now, in the case of Vanderhorst Row, you have the date inscription directly above the central front door, which is also found at Desert Court, in this case on the pedestal of that niche on the front, just above the front door. There was a date inscription right there. Now, Desert Court itself was destroyed by the IRA in 1922, so I'm afraid I can't give you any better pictures than that. Now, with the William Blacklock House, if you look at the front of it, you notice that double front stair, two separate flights supported by a pair of columns in the landing right under the front door. This is likely based, there's a better look at the stair. Now, this is likely based on Desert Court's double stair on the garden front. Again, a double stair with a landing supported by pairs of columns. Very telltale features that Hoban most likely copied as the architect of those buildings in Charleston. Now, Hoban again returned to Charleston around 1810 when we built the William Seabrook Plantation House outside of town on Edisto Island. This is commonly attributed to Hoban. He also, however, and this is where I start to get a little bit of controversy here, he also likely built the Nathaniel Russell House in town as well. The Russell House shares with the Seabrook House the distinctive feature of putting the owner's initials in the wrought iron balcony by the front door. Here on the William Seabrook Plantation House, it's on the main steps, and on the Russell House right above the front door, but both of them have that same cartouche in the iron of the owner's initials. And again, the influence of Desert Court's inscription right over the front entrance door is palpable right here. And something I should also point out is that the Russell House floor plan, which you see here, is a miniature version of the one Hoban used for the President's House in Washington. Just replace the entrance hall of the White House with a spiral stair and scale it all down a bit. The basic layout is exactly the same, right down the large room, the East Room area, on one end. And again, these last two houses were both built in 1810. The Russell House's facade is based on the work of English architect Robert Adam, who used ancient Roman models for his neoclassical buildings, like this one in London at 20 St. James's Square. Stylistically, this is a full generation ahead of Leinster House, but it's also one step behind the Greek Revival. Now, in a few short years, all this would change, and the White House itself would go from relic to ruin. The War of 1812 resulted in the British marching on Washington in 1814. They burned all the major public buildings in the city, and a few private ones. The White House and the Capitol were both left as blackened shells of stone, the interiors entirely burned out. Now, even before the fire, the more radical voices in Congress who followed Thomas Jefferson in pursuing the ideal of small government had argued the White House was just too grand for a presidential residence. Jefferson himself said it could house 2 emperors, a pope, and the Dalai Lama. Might be replaced by a simple row house, like 10 Downing Street in England. Or maybe in an age of increasing populism, you might move the capital itself westward, like several state capitals already had been after the Revolution. The fire of 1814 provided an opportunity for these arguments to be heated at last. However, flush with success after the Battle of New Orleans and the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war, President James Madison decided that the White House should be rebuilt exactly as it was before the fire, as a symbol of America's ability to rebound from adversity and a statement of the dignity of the presidential office. Like a phoenix emerging from its own ashes, the president's house would rise anew. But if this was to happen, time was of the essence. The house had to be rebuilt quickly before opinion in Congress could turn against the reconstruction project and start complaining about the money it cost. And as was rebuild was also the easiest option logistically. The original stonework in many places remained standing, and they was thought it could be retained in the reconstructed house. Madison's political program led to James Hoban, the original architect of the White House, being brought back to supervise the reconstruction in 1817. But despite the need for quick and economical construction, it appears that when he was tapped by Madison, Hoban's starting point was actually a pre-existing proposal for a radical simplification of the exterior stonework, updating the design to a more current style. Hoban's papers, like many of the people Pamela Scott mentioned, were lost in the mid-19th century, but fragments of this proposed redesign survive in two different sources. Now, one of these, I believe, was likely copied from Hoban's original drawings, and another most certainly was. The first of these is this map right here, the 1818 map of Washington, D.C. by printer Robert King. If you zoom in, on the bottom left corner, you see a drawing of the White House as it would be rebuilt after the fire, complete with the south porch or portico that wouldn't be executed for another half-decade. The map shows a central semicircle of columns, you see here the south portico, standing on a series of arches or arcade at basement level. Two dog-leg staircases at right angles lead down from the staterooms to the ground level. Now, basically, this is the south portico as we know it today, and the first visual record of it like that is the King map. There are, however, earlier drawings by Benjamin Latrobe for a proposed White House South portico. These are from before the War of 1812, and they're the earliest such drawings to survive. But, as you can see here, they show an enormous external staircase on the south front that has very little resemblance to the light pair of dog-leg stairs Hoban built. Now, it's most likely that James Hoban, who is always a keen businessman, was the one who supplied Robert King with a drawing for his map. However, the drawing contains several differences from the walls of the White House, as built in 1792. As built, the original house had distinct carved windowsills beneath each first-floor window, and these were supported by large curling brackets, the individual windowsills you can see right here. But in the 1818 drawing, the windowsills are extended and unified into a single horizontal sill or string course, you can see it running along there, and the brackets below the windows are gone. Not only that, the first-floor window heads of the White House as we know it, with their alternate triangular and arched shapes, are instead all triangular. It's a bit odd, but here's the thing. The 1818 map is not the only source for this design. When the north portico of the White House was being built about 10 years later, architect Charles Bulfinch, who was completing the reconstruction of the Capitol at that time, went to Hoban to ask him if there were any drawings he could supply to help with the portico construction. Hoban gave him 3 drawings. One of them was an elevation of the north front, which you see here, and 2 others were plans of the north portico. Bulfinch copied them in his own hand, and these copies Bulfinch made of Hoban's drawings still survive in the Library of Congress. Now, a close look at Bulfinch's north elevation, again, shows a unified windowsill without brackets running beneath the first floor windows. This is inconsistent with the house's built, but exactly the same detail that appears in the 1818 King map. Now, things get even more interesting when you notice how the windowsill interacts with the columns. Because normally when such a sill, or string course as we say in our architectural field of jargon, when that string course runs into a column pedestal, it normally wraps around the base of the pedestal and continues on. But very unusually, in both the Bulfinch drawing and the King map, the string course doesn't wrap around the pedestal interrupts the string course, which is a very quirky detail that suggests the same hand was responsible for both designs. Now, since we know Bulfinch copied this drawing from Hoban's own work, the logical conclusion is the King map also came from a drawing by Hoban himself, and these most likely represented an alternate simplified version of the house exterior with streamlined detailing to update the facade for the Greek Revival era. So, it would seem before the fire, Hoban had already produced a plan for a stylistic update to the White House, including the additions of a north and south portico. Then he used the opportunity of the fire to show off the drawings he had done earlier to Bullfinch, King the Mapmaker, and others. So, the two porticos were eventually built. Nothing came of the idea, however, to refashion the main body of the building due to the demands of politics and economics. But this whole scheme of architecture provides a fascinating glimpse at the design process of James Hoban, and a reminder that we ought to take him more seriously as an architect, perhaps, than we currently do, in many cases. I'm not talking about the James Hoban Society here. Obviously, you all take him very seriously. All right. Now, besides the elevation of the north front, Hoban also provided Bullfinch with two different plans of the north portico. One of his plans, this one, shows the portico is built. It has paired columns in the middle of the portico's east and west sides. This is an arrangement of columns, or intercolumniation, as we again say in architectural jargon, that's highly unusual. Normally, a freestanding portico has its widest opening in the middle, suggesting openness and freedom of movement, especially when you have carriages going through it. But no, Hoban's north portico has the narrowest opening at the center of the east and west sides, exactly what you're normally not supposed to do. But here's the thing. The other plan Bullfinch copied from Hoban has a very different layout. In this version, the portico has the same amount of space between each column and no awkward, narrow central openings. Instead, there are double columns at the point where the portico meets the body of the house, which is a logical place for them to be. Now, the traditional explanation for Hoban's strange portico design is budget. The idea is he preferred to save money by putting the greatest weight of columns at a point where there was solid ground. This contrasts Hoban's design with an earlier proposal for the White House north portico, again by Latrobe, which is linked to the same south portico with a giant staircase I showed you earlier. Again, from before the fire, Latrobe's design for a portico had very large central openings at east and west, as is proper. But it also called for these enormous stone carriage ramps to span the space between the front door of the White House and the ground of the driveway in front. Hoban's designs, however, have the carriageway set off-center on solid ground with steps behind it leading up to the front door. Now, the traditional conclusion has been that Latrobe, a brilliant but financially profligate architect, went for the technically correct solution, while Hoban, the budget-conscious master builder, went for an obviously incorrect but cheaper and easier idea. But the presence of Hoban's alternate north portico design, which itself is technically correct, yet not budget-breaking like Latrobe's ramps here, forces us to re-examine this theory. Now, why would Hoban propose this stylistically awkward north portico that we saw in the photos? I believe he did it because of a strong streak of mannerism in his architectural style. As Brian introduced to us earlier, mannerism is the architectural equivalent of a painter who can deliberately break the rules because he knows his audience will understand and be amused by the violation of norms. Now, Hoban trained as an architect in Ireland in the early 1780s, just when James Gandon was building the Dublin Custom House. Gandon's own style is heavily manneristic sometimes. As Edward McCarthy points out, he picked this up from Christopher Wren, the great English architect. He has architectural puns and motifs that are sometimes seemingly incorrect, but actually winking silently at the informed observer, sometimes inviting us to laugh. And what I'm going to say here is that I think this trait is even more pronounced in Hoban's architecture than it was in Gandon's, because if you see here, this is a single surviving drawing from Hoban's White House competition design of 3 stories from 1792. That's what I reconstructed those drawings earlier from, this one sheet. But if you look at them closely, you see even more evidence of the tongue-in-cheek mannerist tendency of his architecture. Earlier I mentioned the idea of a unified a windowsill, a string course. Now, architects can sometimes stack these vertically, one on top of another, but in doing so, you're supposed to have the bottom one be larger than the top one, so the lower course is the one that looks heavier, so the building doesn't look like it's top-heavy. Now, here, in this close-up, you see Hoban's 1792 competition design has 2 string courses between the first and second floors, but the upper one is nearly twice the size of the lower one. Now, that would normally be wrong, except Hoban wasn't ignorant of the rule here, because he split the upper course into 2 adjoining sections, so each half of it, taken on its own, is smaller than the lower string course, as you'd expect, as it should be. This is not an architect whose style was entirely stodgy or boring or unimaginative. This is an architect with a very strong playful streak. And even though Hoban could have built the normal-looking north portico, he told Bulfinch, apparently, to build the one that makes us scratch our heads. Now, I want to pause for a minute and note that this sort of architectural joke would fly almost entirely under the radar of most American observers in the early 1800s. Our most skilled native craftsmen were still learning the rudiments of the architectural orders. Benjamin Henry Latrobe's Greek Revival style, which was plain and open and as simple as possible, was much more fitted to a young nation. But James Hoban's architecture, as you can see here, is subtler than it looks, and speaks to the wiser, more educated nation that we might one day become. Now, James Hoban wanted the old White House rebuilt exactly on the outside, just as it was before the fire. And it largely was, except for the porticos, of course, but on the inside, Hoban took license to update and redesign the interior layout. As shown in this late 19th century plan, the state dining room, which was originally in the northwest corner, moved to the southwest corner, and a new door was inserted linking the central oval saloon, called the Blue Room today, with the parlor we know as the Green Room. Because in the pre-fire layout, seen here by Latrobe, the oval saloon had only one door leading into what was now the Red Room on the opposite side of the house from the East Room, at the eastern end, the big room. The redesign of the oval room, which you see here, you can also see how the dining room moved, by the way. The redesign of the oval room is a case where we see Hoban drawing directly on literary sources for his architecture. In this case, his most likely source was an unbuilt design for Kettleston Hall in England by the architect James Paine in the 1760s. Paine was replaced as architect before Kettleston was finished by the extremely famous Robert Adam, which is why Paine's work there is not often remembered. But Paine published his ideas for Kettleston in a book of plans of his architectural designs, and so Hoban could easily have seen them, because this was a printed book. You could buy it in the architectural bookstore. Now, Paine's design for the rear front of Kettleston, like the south portico of the White House, has a central semicircle of columns set above a series of arches at basement level. Behind the columns, you have a circular parlor with three closely grouped doors set in the wall directly opposite the windows. A similar arrangement of doors is found in the post-fire oval room Hoban built, which replaces the pre-fire configuration, which had only two doors placed at right angles. Now, the model for the White House South Portico has long been a source of debate among architectural historians because it's wondering, did Latrobe dream this up? Did he get it from a French source? Was it a chateau? But this situation is, again, confused by the uncertainty over whether Hoban or Latrobe was the first one to come up with the idea of a portico in the first place. I'm going to sidestep that latter controversy today, but I'm just going to say that the strong similarities of elevation and plan between Paine's Kettleston design seen here and Hoban's South Portico as built suggest that in James Hoban's mind, at least, this building was the primary source for the South Portico and Blue Room as built after the fire. Now, the North Portico also has its own likely source in English neoclassicism. This is Carlton House in London, the opulent residence of the Prince Regent, later George IV. The whole interior of the house was decorated in the newly fashionable Grecian, or Greek Revival taste, what in England is known as the Regency style. Now, like Hoban's portico, the Carlton House portico has an off-center carriageway, you can see it there, in front of a flight of steps. And like Hoban's other alternate design for the North Portico, which I showed you a few minutes ago, this Carlton House portico had double columns right where the portico joined the body of the house. Now, Carlton House was the embryo of Greek Revival style in London society, while James Paine's plan for Kettleston, which was a bit more conservative, was nonetheless a stylistic flourish among the more conservative architecture of the mid-18th century. The old walls of the White House might be staying the same, but through porticos and interior revisions, Hoban was still determined to bring the house into the modern democratic age. Part of Hoban's task in rebuilding the White House was doing so as quickly as possible to avoid the scrutiny of a hostile Congress, which had little idea of the true scope of the damage to the stone walls. These had been damaged not just by the fire, but also by a great downpour of rain that fell immediately afterwards. This put out the flames, but also caused the heated sandstone to split and crack. This meant the job of reconstruction had to be expedited in some cases by cutting corners. under the supervision of Hoban and Samuel Lane, who was the Commissioner of Public Buildings in Washington, D.C., the house was rebuilt with an inner core of brick significantly weaker than what had stood before the fire. Many interior walls that had previously been of brick were also now framed in simple wood. The resulting structural weakness, combined with the loads put on the house by 150 years of presidential alterations and technological advancement, resulted in the house's interior being unstable over time. Ultimately, the corners cut during the 1816-17 reconstruction resulted in the total demolition and rebuilding of the interior White House beyond the stone walls during the Harry Truman presidency. But on the outside, much of the stonework that was left standing after the fire as well was too brittle to be reused in the reconstructed house, as Hoban had hoped. The unusable portions of the sandstone walls were taken down, even just to the level of the basement story in some parts, and these were replaced with new sandstone patches carved to match the old. But in some places, the original walls did remain in place. The house's south bow, for instance, had enough usable stonework to stay up to the roof level. Because of that, enough of the original stone remained that Hoban was compelled to retain the original pattern of elaborate carved decoration which the house had originally had on the exterior. As you can see here, the old walls of aqueous sandstone from before the fire are still blackened by the fire beneath their coat of white paint. During the original building campaign in the 1790s, the house had been covered by a coat of whitewash, which was meant to seal the sandstone, protect it against the elements. The whitewash could have been allowed to weather away over time, sealing the sandstone but leaving its grayish-brown grain, which you see here exposed to the eye. But appearances count in the presidency, and even in Thomas Jefferson's day, the whitewash was being covered over with white paint as soon as it began to fade. But the fire of 1814 and the scars it left on the sandstone walls cemented this decision. The grain on the sandstone, now blackened by fire, would be covered with white paint. Now, because of budget concerns, the building of the north and south porticos was delayed for several years. The south portico was built during James Monroe's presidency, and the north portico under Andrew Jackson. These were built not of aqueous sandstone to match the body of the house, but of Seneca sandstone, which turns red with prolonged exposure to air. So both the porticos and the house would have to be overlaid with the same white paint, unified. The president's house, commissioned by George Washington, thus became the White House. Now, before I end this talk, I want to note that the north and south porticos are not the only places where Hoban revised the design of the house when he rebuilt it. Benjamin Latrobe's drawings from before the fire, again of the porticos I showed you earlier, include an elevation of the east side of the building. Now, there's one detail that stands out. In the frieze above the arched central first-floor window, Latrobe sketched in lightly a series of circles, suggesting a pattern of carved decoration above the window opening. And, as it happens, shortly after the fire, the Washington, D.C. resident artist William Strickland, who was one of Latrobe's pupils, went to the side of the president's house and drew an engraving of the ruined building. Partially, he made reference to an earlier watercolor by a man named George Munger, but he also supplemented this with his own detailed observations of the site. He drew in a blackened lightning rod and sketched the details of the charred house as it stood then after the fire. Now, what did Strickland draw in the frieze of the central first-floor window right there on the east side? A series of circular flower blooms as carved decoration sitting above the window opening, matching what Latrobe drew in his own pre-fire study of the east side of the house. Now, on the White House walls as we know them today, there's no such pattern of carved flowers there. The window frieze is blank. But here's what we also know, that the western and eastern central arched windows were both areas where Hoban had to take down the damaged walls to basement level and rebuild them upwards, rebuilding the first and second floor walls on east and west sides in 1816-17. So it appears that, in a small way, at the centerpieces of the house's four walls, north, south, east, west, James Hoban got a chance to realize the stylistic update of the White House for the modern age he wanted to make after all. Now, this concludes my presentation, and I hope in speaking to you here today I've shed some light and maybe answered some of your questions on James Hoban and the architecture of the White House, or better yet, inspired some new ones.